one day you're going to look back and you're just going to be amazed at who this child is. It just blows my mind every day at how strong she is because she has to face a lot of adversity, and deaf do in the world when they get out there and this.
Welcome to the second series of Love is a Classroom, Stories of Inclusion, a podcast about creating high-quality, meaningful, inclusive experiences for children with and without disabilities. In each series, I share the stories of teams that come together through love to create high-quality, meaningful, inclusive experiences for children and families. This is the second series. If you missed the first series, with a team coming together to provide an inclusive experience for Archer, a child with cerebral palsy, I encourage you to listen. In this 5-part series, you will be introduced to the team that came together to create an authentic, inclusive experience for Navee Walker, a deaf child. We will hear stories from Miss Onifray, her kindergarten teacher, Brooke Walker, her mother, Wendy, the interpreter, and her first grade teacher, Miss Anderson. Please subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Today, I'm here with
Brooke, and I have 4 children, 2 girls and 2 boys, ages 14, 11, 7, and 5.
In the first episode of the second series of Love is a Classroom, Stories of Inclusion, Brooke Walker will introduce us to a story about a team coming together to create and maintain an inclusive environment that met the needs of her daughter, Navee Walker, who's deaf. There's no question that Navee's inclusion helps any classroom community she joins. There is a serious concern about whether or not the necessary supports for academic growth are available. It's an issue many children experience. Let's get started.
We adopted Navee when she was 4.5 years old. When we first matched with her, we'd never met Wendy. We just knew that we had a deaf child that we were bringing home. I posted on social media, does anybody know ASL or where we can learn it? This was my very first post. And Wendy commented and said, why do you want to learn? That was just her question. And so I reached out to her and told her why. She started coming to our church that summer every week and holding a class for me and my family. And that's how we got to know her, was just through this class. And also through the class, she began to teach us about deaf community, deaf culture. I would probably message her weekly and say, should I sign this? Because there's different ways to sign things. How do we find this in this area? What's a good way to teach her this? My parents were really hesitant in the beginning. They were like, are you sure you know what you're doing? And Wendy gave them this like whole new view on deaf and how incredible you can do anything that you want to do when you're deaf, you just can't hear. I think they had a different thought process. They were nervous about it all, and they didn't realize that she was going to be like so incredible. She really helped them through that. But that's how we met her. Wendy was one of the first people to meet Navee. Navee had no language at that point in time. So if she needed something, it was just point, cry, stomp her feet. That was her method of communication. And that was probably one of our biggest concerns. We began to sign mama and daddy and just little things like that. And it took a couple weeks for that to click. Oh, this is how I'm going to communicate. And even then, we had prepared by going to classes and things. We were fluent, but I guess in our minds, we prepared just in case she did know some sign language and she didn't. So then we stepped back and we're like, we're going to learn this together.
It sounds like it was a real whirlwind when you brought Navee home. There was a lot of growing and a lot of learning for everyone. Can you tell us a little bit more about who Navee is?
She is a very confident, very strong-willed girl, and she's naturally a leader. She is so confident in that. It doesn't take her long to warm up in an environment. We have 3 other children, and we're constantly at ball games We're always out in the community, and we wondered how people would interact with her and how people would include her in their lives. And we've been very thankful and grateful because our community is just, I mean, I meet people all the time that tell me how affected they are by just watching Navee's growth, and they've really just taken her in. I think she senses that inclusion and she knows that people want to be around her. The deaf school being an hour and a half from us, I really didn't think it would be possible for us to send her there. It's a boarding school and a lot of kids live there, even the 5-year-olds. But being that she's adopted and we were trying to introduce her to what the family unit even was, we knew that wasn't a scenario for her. But I was like, just so I can be connected to the campus and they have resources, we decided to take a tour of the campus. And I really just fell in love with it because she's being raised by hearing parents and hearing siblings. And so there's definitely a disadvantage in that because she doesn't have the fluency that someone that grew up in a deaf home is going to have because we don't sign fluently. And so I wanted her to know, one, that she's not the only deaf person, that there's a whole community like her. And two, I wanted her really to be able to get a feel for the language in a way that we couldn't provide her. So that's how when I visited the school, I realized the teachers, the principals, the janitor, everybody either signs or they are deaf. Just to be immersed in that. If you're trying to learn Spanish and you're immersed in Spanish, you're more than likely going to become more fluent than taking a class. So we felt like for her language to grow as fast as it possibly could, that's what we needed to do in the beginning. So we did that, and we did that for a year, and she really began her signing, of course, got fantastically better than it was when she had no words. She still wasn't signing a lot. It wasn't as much expressive language. She understood what we were signing. She understood what her teachers were signing, but for her to express that back to you was still very limited. But after a year at the school, if I'm just being honest, we were exhausted because it was an hour and a half drive. And we were getting up at 4:30 in the morning every day, taking her to a bus stop, putting her on a bus. She wouldn't get back home until after 6 in the evening, and then she would go straight to bed. So we weren't really getting to spend time with her. She was tired. We were tired. And after a year, we felt like we had made some progress on language, which was what our goal was. So we thought, let's try to put her in public school. And worst case scenario, if it totally fails and she quits signing, then we'll go back to Talladega and we'll know that it didn't work. But in fact, we saw the opposite.
Y'all moved to the public school. Did Wendy have any influence on this decision? And was she involved in one way or another?
We'd always said it would be cool one day if Wendy could be her interpreter. When we decided to move her to public school, my husband and I started to tell Wendy about it. And then we were like, no, we don't want to pressure her into being her interpreter because she was already with a student at another school. So we were coming in February and we didn't want her to feel like pressure to leave the student she was with and come with us. So we were just like, we'll worry about it next year. I enrolled her in public school. I just turned in the paperwork. I'm not even told my parents. And the next morning at 6 a.m., my phone rings and it's Wendy. And she said, are you moving Navee Walker public school? How on earth would you know that? And she said, I was looking for a job posting because the one where she was at was not going to be able to, her contract wasn't going to continue. She was having to leave that job. And she was online, just like looking for a job when it popped up, and she knew that was my city and she knew that was Navee's age. Immediately, she accepted that job and she's been with us ever since.
Wow. Were there any other concerns about her development besides losing sign language when she entered the public school?
I was nervous because, one, I didn't know how the other kids would treat her. I didn't know how she was going to do with the language because her teacher signed at Talladega and everyone was deaf at Talladega. And so just moving to a hearing school and being the only kid with an interpreter, the whole thing, I just thought, what if she totally shuts down and just does it? Because when she doesn't like something, she shuts down.
Was there anything that eased your concerns as you transitioned Navi into the public school, into her kindergarten classroom?
She was going to have Miss Onifray, the same teacher that my other kids had. Miss Onifray told her class, we have a new student coming. She's deaf. She uses sign language. Like, she thoroughly educated those kids. So when we get in there, Navi's nervous because she doesn't really know what we're doing. All the kids are in the floor waiting on her, and all those eyes on her. She was terrified. She did go and let Miss Onifray put her in her lap, and they did a story. And Navi just was watching all the kids out of the corner of her eye, and she was like, "That looks fun." And so by the time we were leaving the classroom, she was starting to come out of her shell, but she wasn't quite there yet. And the principal came down the hall and took Navi's hand and took her to the library. And Navi loves books. And they got to the library and they started giving her toys and books. And at that point, I think she felt like she had some control over the room because it was just a few teachers and they were pretty much just doing whatever she wanted to do. The next day, when she went to school without me, dropped her off at the front just like all the other students. I could tell she was hesitant, but she has a great memory. And as soon as she seen Miss Onifray, she was like, fine. And all the other teachers that were standing on the sidewalk when she got out wanted to help her and wanted to help her get to her classroom. And she was like, I got this. I remember where my classroom is. I got it. She was waving them off. I don't need help. Went straight to her classroom, and the rest was history. She was just totally fine. It's incredible how she pushes herself and how driven she is. But people don't know that. They immediately want to help her do things. And she's immediately, don't help me.
Yeah, sadly, I don't think that's too uncommon. Navi was thriving in kindergarten with Miss Onifray. What were the things that you saw differently as she went into first grade, and how did those play out in her academic performance?
One thing that I've learned is that a deaf student needs a TOD, which is the teacher of the deaf. I was not familiar with that term. And it wasn't until like I pondered across it on a Facebook page that I realized that's like the missing piece of the puzzle that we didn't have. So our school system had some deaf students, but they were deaf plus, like they were deaf, but they also had some other learning disabilities, or they had cochlears, but they spoke and they didn't sign. So they've never really been anyone just like Navi. And so we would have meetings with Miss Onifray. She was like, I feel like I'm trying to recreate the wheel here because I've never taught a deaf student and I'm not sure how. There was just like a missing piece. Like, she's an amazing teacher. We have Wendy, who's amazing, but she's not a teacher either. So it's like, how do we teach a deaf child to read when that's not typical? You don't sound it out like the other kids learn to read. And so we were just missing, what do we do and how do we do this? And then I find out a TOD, there's a specific curriculum for deaf children to learn to read. And we didn't have a TOD, so we have one this year. And that has been like such a game changer. Having a TOD, having somebody that has experience teaching the deaf has been like that liaison. She takes an hour out of the day to work on like reading with a TOD or math with a TOD, so they can really break stuff down. And that's been really helpful at like bringing that all together. She's behind where my other kids were, but she's doing great.
What are the supports and services that are written into Navi's individual education program, or IEP?
She has an IEP that says she has an interpreter while she is at school the entire time, and that she has the TOD and how many, hours or how many minutes a week she has. Those are the only support she has in place. We originally had speech because we were really working with her cochlear to develop language, just the English language. But then when we got to first grade and we were working so hard on learning to read and learning to count, speech became put on the back burner because we feel like you can be successful in life if you know how to read and you know how to do math, but you really don't have to be able to speak English to be successful. Likewise, if you flip the coin, if we worked more on teaching her to talk, But then she got more behind on reading and math. We felt like that was more of a disservice to her. So we decided to stop spending so much time on speech and really focus on reading and math because she prefers to sign, and she didn't have language for so many years. We wanted her to have the control over what language she chose, which tends to be ASL.
So does she have a cochlear implant?
She does. She only wears it about half the time. She can recognize environmental sounds. When the dog barks, she lets him in. If cars come in, she knows a car's coming. She doesn't really have to have them. She rarely asks for them. Every now and then she'll say, I want to wear my cochlear. When I go put it on her, she's fine with it, but she's neutral in that area. When we have T-ball or if we're going to the beach for a week, we don't even take it because it's too much trouble. It drives her insane to have something clipped in her hair while she's diving in and it comes out. So if we're going to the beach, cochlear stays at home. She uses it at school so her teacher can say her name and she'll look up, things like that.
That's interesting. Was there any kind of fight to get the TOD?
I was avoiding this topic because I don't like to talk about things that are negative, but not as complicated.
One of the things that we're dealing with right now, and what I'm realizing very quickly, is Navee's deafness needs to be addressed in the education system, but more than that, it's her language deprivation. For the last 2 months, I have been studying and researching everything that I can find on IEPs or individual education plans to help Navee. The very first IEP meeting that I went to 2 years ago, I had no idea what it was. I had no idea what to expect. When you go to a school, you don't help your teacher decide how to teach your child. You don't pick a curriculum, none of that stuff. You send them to school, you're hearing children, and you trust that they're going to educate your child up to the standards that the federal and state say are appropriate. And you just trust that's going to happen. Like when I go to the doctor and I just trust that the doctor is going to find what's wrong with me and treat that. I'm not going to have to go home and research that. So with education, I'm just trusting that they're doing what's best for my kid. And I've learned over the last 2 years that maybe they don't know what's best for my kid because she's very unique. So I began to study, and I printed out the Alabama Administrative Code. I printed out the federal laws on education and making sure that your child has FAPE, which is the free and appropriate education in the public system. So there's a lot that I didn't know that I had to learn. And that was my starting point of, okay, this is how it's supposed to go. And then I go into Navee's specific situation. And that's what makes it a little bit more difficult because there's not a lot of information out there on a language-deprived deaf child. So there are some guidelines to go by for deaf children's education, and they aren't really always recognized. During the process of this, I was connected to a lady at Boston University. Her name is Kristen DePremia. I just really have been talking to her, and she actually wrote the curriculum called Bedrock. Bedrock is the curriculum that's recommended to use for deaf and language-deprived children. They're telling me you need 90 minutes of Bedrock a day and 40 minutes of the bilingual curriculum in addition to that. And Navee's only seeing her TOD about twice a week, so I can't imagine that she's getting the consistency that she needs to learn to read. I'm realizing now that this group of children like Navee are completely left out in the cold when it comes to education. So we're requesting more, but on top of that, she doesn't learn to read like the hearing children. And that's something that we've really had to come to terms with this year specifically because they're working on phonics and they're working on sentence structure. It's not only that Navee doesn't have language, she doesn't have a first language. She doesn't know how grammar works. She doesn't have the exposure to vocabulary like hearing kids do. There's no guidelines set up. There's no one saying, okay, here's a language deprived deaf child. This is how we need to educate them. Instead, they're putting them with the hearing children standards and the hearing children curriculum, and they're making them take the iReady test, and none of this is set up to help Navee. Does she need to be included in the classroom? Absolutely. Does she need to follow the same standards and curriculum as a hearing child to learn to read? it's not going to work. And Kristen DePremi was telling me a lot of times the states will just not really be sure how to approach these kids. So it just becomes sink or swim, and usually they sink. And so I'm recognizing this year how important it is that we come up with a clear plan on how to educate her. And we are trying to address this with our local school system. And we're getting a lot of pushback just because some of the things we're asking for and the things that we think that maybe she needs from our research, they don't think she needs, or we have different opinions on. I'm not an educator, but I have done a lot of research and I have reached out to a lot of professionals. And so I'm now asking them, like, okay, if you don't want to use what I have found and the guidelines and the research that I have done, show me your research and show me how you're educating her. If you have a proven method, I can get on board with that. I'm not an unreasonable person. So far, I haven't gotten that information, so we're still in this process, but I'm learning very quickly that change needs to be made for kids like Navee. There's got to be some sort of guidelines in place when these kids come through the system, because I feel like I'm pretty well studied. I've been to graduate school. I know how to find information and read it and study it. Can't imagine if I didn't have the resources that I have and just the education in general, how hard it would be for me to walk through this system. And so I'm sure most parents are like me on the very first day of my very first IEP meeting. I was just like, yes, you're the teachers. This is a formality. I'm going to sign this. I'm going to trust you to do what's best for my child. I'm learning that's actually not always the case. It's just been difficult. And I know that there are things on their side that I can't see and I don't understand. I feel like something has to change, because there are kids that are just getting left behind every day because no one knows what to do with them. It's very frustrating.
Thank you for sharing that experience. Right? You raise critical questions, concerns about inclusion. There's no question inclusion has been powerful for you and for other children in Navee's classroom. But it's also clear that to make it meaningful for all children, the correct supports need to be in place. And the thing that frustrates me is the additional supports often help far more children than the child with a disability, and people don't recognize that. We don't realize how many children are disabled by the approaches that our education system take to teaching. And I appreciate the trust that you mentioned that you have in the system. And I think that that is needed, absolutely, and it's lacking often. But at the same time, we need to interrogate the instructional strategies and the teaching practices and ask ourselves why so many children in our school system are not succeeding. And it's not just children who have IEPs. The only children really succeeding are the ones in the middle, those children who can adapt to any instruction. And my position is that if we tailor instruction to the margin, the children who have IEPs, the children who can't access the curriculum, then all children can thrive. I'm interested in hearing more about your work advocating for Navee's rights. Can you talk a little bit more about the action that you took in the past to address the need for additional support?
We asked for a TOD and they wrote it in, but they never provided one. The next year, they tried to take it out of the IEP. I spoke to my friends in the school system that also had deaf children, and I'm like, if we all ask for a TOD, they'll hire one, because you share it among all the deaf students. I'm like, it'll benefit everybody. So we have the meeting, and they're like, we don't have a TOD. Those are hard to find. But if we find one, we'll put it in your IEP later. And I'm like, that's not how it works. You put it in now and then find one. So I was able to get that TOD wrote into our IEP. My other friends were not. And they were afraid to put their foot down. And it was written into mine. Come August, they did not have a TOD in place. And so the week of school, we transferred her to a school that already had a TOD, because we wanted to see what the TOD was about. And turns out it's really a great thing. And so we're going to go back to the school where my other kids are, and we're going to fight for it.
Let me get this straight. You had a TOD on the IEP in kindergarten, but the district didn't have one. Then you had the IEP meeting. They proposed to take it out because there wasn't one. So you moved her to a different school, one that's different from your other children.
And aside from that, spoke to our Department of Public Education, and now the director knows my name, and she explained to me that there is a grant in place for all interpreters and TODs where it doesn't cost the school system any money. It's just some paperwork. I also have that now where I'm like, look, this isn't going to cost you any money, and this is what's best for her education, and that is your responsibility is to provide free access to public education. Learning a lot of these terms.
I think that the language and terms that are used are almost as much of a barrier for families as the actual policies and practices. Hearing you talk about all the work you have done and the fighting you have done for Navee, it makes me think about how we have general education and special education, and the politics are different, especially once you get into later education. But it even occurs in preschool and younger. It's something that's not really clear in early childhood, because of the emphasis of the curricula in kindergarten and preschool. It's about social emotional development, expressive communication, adaptive skills. Those are less of issues that disable Navee because she had great teachers. But now as her reading and math are more rigorous, it seems like those are disabling Navee more than previous expectations. This is a challenge other families confront, as you recognized. Do you have advice for those families or any other families that you would like to share?
My first gut reaction is, don't be afraid. I think that in the beginning, I was afraid. And now, if I had a child that was deaf before Navee, I would have been devastated with that diagnosis. If I'm just being honest, I would have been like, my kid can't hear. I would have been really upset. If I had a child today and they were born and the doctor came in and said, your child's deaf, I would be like, oh, that's cool. It would not create sadness in me that it would have 3 years ago, because Navee has just shown me how incredible she is. She's stronger than I'll ever be. And so just to be able to see her walk through not having language to now learning to read, and it just blew me away. So the first thing that I tell parents that reach out to me, and they're just like, one day you're going to look back and you're just going to be amazed at who this child is. It just blows my mind every day at how strong she is, because she has to face a lot of adversity, and deaf do in the world when they get out and they're independent, and they have to go to a restaurant, they have to order their food, and there's all sorts of things that they have to do that's different than us. But as people who they are, wonderful, incredible. I'm so blessed to be able to just to be part of Navee's life. And then the second thing is educate yourself on accessibility and deaf rights, because that's probably one of the biggest things that we run into.
Thank you so much, Brooke, for taking the time to talk with me and share your story and experiences.
Thank you.
In this episode, Brooke Walker introduced us to the power of inclusion for Navee and her family, but concerns for the future are evident. In episode 2, Miss Onifray will illuminate Brooke's feelings about why inclusion is important for children with and without disabilities during early childhood. In episode 3 of this series, Miss Anderson extends the sentiment and belief as well as draws attention to injustices, and together we consider how to move forward. In episode 5, the highly admired Wendy Bowman will tell us stories as well as teach us about deaf culture and deaf education. Our 5th and final episode will include Navee Walker herself. Thank you for listening to Love is a Classroom, Stories of Inclusion. Please subscribe to the podcast, post a review, and share our episodes. You can follow us at Love is a Classroom on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube. If you are a teacher or a parent or an advocate who would like to share your story, please go to loveisaclassroom.com, click on Contact, and share a brief summary of your experience. Until next time, choose love, choose inclusion.